Colleagues, esteemed guests, it's on behalf of the Presidential Board of the Academy of Sciences that it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to today's Karl Popper lecture here in the festive hall of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And I would like to extend a particularly warm welcome to tonight's speaker, Professor Francesco Billari, as well as to all members of the Academy, colleagues, friends. And of course, I would like to greet also a few particular guests of honor. Wolfgang Lutz, former director of the Vienna Institute of Demography and founding director of the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital. Alexia Fürnkrantz-Priskowitz, also former director of the Vienna Institute of Demography. And Mark Louis, the current director of the Vienna Institute of Demography, who will introduce the speaker and whom I will ask to come to the podium in a minute. I would also like to welcome the representatives from several federal ministries, notably the Federal Ministry for Women, Science and Research and the Ministry of Defense, as well as the Federal Chancellery. And I would like to extend a warm welcome to Regina Fuchs, Chief Statistical Officer of Österreichische Nationalbank. As the name suggests, this lecture is dedicated to Karl Popper and the research he did. Popper, as we all know, was born in Vienna and was one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. And with his vision of the open society and his insistence on critical reflection rather than the comfort of supposed certainties, he continues to shape how we think about science and democracy to this day. And this Karl Popper lecture is part of the so-called Academy Lecture series, which addresses pressing societal challenges shaped by technological change and global interdependencies, as it says on the description, which you find on your invitation. And this evening's lecture turns on one of the defining transformations of our time, which is demographic change and the an increasingly diverse world and society. And this is a very important topic also for this academy, quite beyond the really important research done at the Vienna Institute for Demography. Just to give you a few examples, last year we had our joint Academy Day together with the Swiss academies, and we devoted this to the topic of an aging society. And it was in this very room where we discussed together with colleagues from Switzerland and also other nations how to deal with an aging society. And when we had a chat briefly before this lecture, Francesco disclosed to us that he just attracted funding, I hope I can say this, of a considerable amount from the Reconstruction Fund to deal with the topic of an aging society. And how to deal with an aging society is also one of the focal points which we have in our development plan and other documents. And it's also something that is important for this institution, for the Academy. We are here in the festive hall and we see the magnificent fresco of Guglielmo from 1755. And you see the 4 faculties of the university, because this was the University of Vienna then. And you see a scientific community that was quite different, that was much less diverse. It was mostly reserved to men. It was mostly reserved to those who could afford education or who were born into families rather that gave them access to education. Today's academy is very different. I'm really proud to say that after it took the first 100 years to elect the first female member, we now have hit the mark of 50% with the academy members, female academy members under the age of 60. We are very diverse when it comes to social backgrounds. We are very diverse from a geographical point of view, trying to attract the most excellent and brilliant brains from all over the world, which is sometimes not easy because we have a heated debate on which language to choose at this academy. Some, insist on preserving the German language, whether others suggest to turn to the more international English. And of course, we're also diverse in terms of age. We're trying to recruit our new membership from those who are still a little bit far away from retirement. But as Mark keeps telling us, when you're a member of the academy, statistically, you have good prospects of longevity, actually. So the age span will increase. Well, anyway, it's all these dimensions of diversity and some more that Professor Billari will be explaining to us today. They are one of the focal points of his work on demography and hyperdiversity. It's not me who's going to tell you about all his merits, just to mention that as a sociologist and demographer, as well as rector of Bocconi University in Milan, he has contributed significantly to our understanding of population change and its societal implications, and it's a huge honor and privilege to have him with us tonight. And as I said, it's not me who will tell you about his work and the topic. It's going to be Mark Louis, director of the Vienna Institute of Demography. Mark, the floor is yours, and I wish us all a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Dear class President Wendehorst, dear Francesco, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome Francesco Billari for this Karl Popper lecture of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and I'm very pleased that today's speaker and the topic of his lecture have attracted such a strong interest. I would like to say that I want to introduce briefly our speaker, what is really difficult, so I do my best to go through your vita. Francesco Billari graduated from Bocconi University in Milan. So you started your career already there with a degree in political economy in 1994. In 1998, he obtained a PhD in demography from the University of Padua. And from 1999 to 2002, he was the leader of a research group at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Rostock. And already then, he became professor of demography at Bocconi University from 2002 until 2005 as associate and later as full professor. He subsequently moved to the University of Oxford, then as statutory professor of sociology and demography and director of the Department of Sociology, and as professorial fellow at Nuffield College before returning to Bocconi University in 2017. There he has held then several positions as Dean for Development, founding director of the Carlo F. Dondena Center for Research on Social Dynamics and Public Policy, director of the Master of Science in Economic and Social Sciences. He was Dean of the Faculty, then Deputy Rector, and in 2022 he has been appointed Rector of Bocconi University, what he is still today. Francesco was President, Secretary General, and Treasurer of the European Association for Population Studies and President of the Italian Association for Population Studies. He has also received many honors for his research contributions on demography and the study of life courses, sociology and social policies. For example, he was appointed Fellow of the British Academy, Fellow of the European Academy of Sociology, and last but not least, he is corresponding member abroad of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Moreover, he was awarded by the Population Association of America with the very prestigious Clifford C. Clock Award for Mid-Career Achievement. He also received an honorary doctorate from the Faculty of Economic, Social and Political Sciences and Communication from Université Catholique de Louvain. And last but not least, as we have heard already, he has obtained several competitive research funding, including also an ERC advanced grant. Yeah, so this was a very impressive academic career, but I would like to add a few remarks on his equally impressive impact on the field of demography. In demography, his main research interests include fertility and family change. This is how I learned Francesco as a researcher in this field, the transition to adulthood, life course analysis, comparative surveys, population forecasting, and more recently, also digitalization and demography. Francesco is without doubt one of the most influential demographers of my generation. In 2002, he introduced, together with two colleagues, the term lowest low fertility. So lowest low fertility refers to a total fertility rate at or below 1.3 children per woman, a concept that has since become firmly established not only in demographic research, but much beyond. But his work is not just statistical. He has shown that demographic change does not simply happen. It's deeply connected to expectations, narratives, and the broader social context in which people make their decisions, and this will also become very clear in his lecture today. Yeah, his research interests have always created a close connection with our institute, the Vienna Institute of Demography, leading to several joint publications, and he was also a member of our scientific advisory board and always very supportive of our institute. I've known him for more than 25 years now, and I still remember our first meeting. It was in Rostock in 1999 at a seminar at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research. So you should know that Francesco and I are the same age. And while I was sitting there as a very fresh PhD student, Francesco was introduced there as the new independent research group leader at the Max Planck Institute, what was quite impressive for me at this time. My closest professional interaction with Francesco was during his term as president of the European Association of Population Studies, when I served as Secretary General together with him. And what I particularly remember are the walks from the hotel to the meeting venues, when he shared his experiences of leadership with me, what was really very valuable also for my own career. Okay, I was reminded of those conversations when I read a recent and very interesting interview with Francesco in the Authority magazine. It was just two weeks ago. And in this interview, he was asked about his favorite life lesson, quote. And then you said, "If I have seen further, it is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants." And then he explained, "It reminds me that we need to build on previous knowledge, the fruit of generations and the contribution of many people, but also that we need to use our starting point to look ahead. This applies to life and it applies to university." And I would now finally add that this applies also very much to today's lecture entitled Demography and Hyperdiversity. Let me say that the term hyperdiversity has not yet been established in demography. So Francesco is using this term to capture the complex layering of diversities within populations, which emerge from major demographic and societal processes. And perhaps today we are witnessing him introducing another concept that may shape demographic thinking alongside lowest low fertility, so namely the term hyperdiversity. Francesco, we are really very honored that you are here today, and we are very much looking forward to your lecture. And once again, very warm welcome to Vienna.
Thank you very much, dear Section President Van der Horst. Thank you very much, dear Mark, dear Director. It's a fantastic honor to be here, and I would like to ask the audience to lower expectations because the introduction has been a bit overwhelming for me. So I will try to discuss this topic, and you will see my love for the idea of demography, you will also see how impactful has been the work of the demographers here in Vienna, broadly speaking, and some of them are in the room, and I will use your work as well. I hope I make justice to what you're doing. So this is the structure of the lecture, and I'm happy to share the slides if you are interested. I'm in the process of working on a book on this topic, so any suggestion is more than welcome. I will start with the key ideas so that if you, maybe it will help you in following what I do next. Then I will go through 4 revolutions: longevity, education, gender, migration. Of course, maybe all the technical bits can be discussed, and each of these revolutions will bring a particular type of diversity, which I will discuss. These diversities will then intersect each other, and I will discuss further why we need a further exacerbation of the idea of superdiversity, which has already been used also in a paper in demography, and also with an influential role of the Vienna group. And I will finish in trying to have a more Popperian sense and thinking that the idea of diversity, it's already been discussed by the section president, has to do with the idea of an open society. But to have an open society, we need to think carefully about these topics. And maybe, I mean, being a bit pompous here, I wrote towards a new social contract, but I put a question mark also to be a bit more modest. So here are the key ideas in 2 slides. Maybe you can relax a bit later if you don't like data. So the first idea is that, I mean, when we talk about diversity, and I will try to argue in what sense, the world has never been as diverse as it is today. We are living the most diverse moment of human history. I'll try to qualify with some data this assertion. Then the world is as diverse, is so diverse that we need the hyperdiversity concept to describe it. And this hyperdiversity is the concept of a number of revolutions. And as a demographer, I'm glad to tell you that demography is the mother of hyperdiversity. So the demographic change, and in particular mortality decline and what I define as the longevity revolution, it's not only me basically, is the mother of all revolutions. At the end of this process, hyperdiversity means that we get to what Popper would love to say, almost to the individual level. We have kind of an individualistic perspective on population. Each of us is then, I use a Nobel Prize, Amartya Sen word, is diversity different. Because each of us is at the intersection of the various dimensions of diversity. Moreover, we also change during our life, and this is clear to all of us, and this life is getting longer, which means even more diversity. Hyperdiversity, moreover, is positive news for humanity. The revolutions that brought us to hyperdiversity have allowed more human talents to flourish, have allowed a bigger contribution from various members of the globe. And here I'm taking a global perspective, but of course I'll end up with Vienna as well. And this is the baseline idea for the progressive view of humanity. Of course, we will go back to the standing on the shoulder of giants, but the starting point of view is that we are starting from a good moment because of hyperdiversity. Yet, of course, no revolution is a gala dinner. You will forgive me for a quote of Mao Zedong. And with hyperdiversity is also not a gala dinner. There are some challenges that we need to think about. One of the challenges is that we tend to simplify a complex reality. And ideally, the biggest simplification, this was also the argument of Amartya Sen, is when you have a binary perspective. Us and them, men and women, nationals and foreigners. So the more we oversimplify a reality which is hyper diverse and complex, the more we may fall into the possibility of creating polarization and make easy backlashes against the advantages that diversity is bringing to us. So our future will depend crucially on recognizing this diversely different meaning, identity, and nature of the human being, especially today, and embedding that in a new social contract, maybe we could say, given the topic of this lecture, of an open society. So these are the key ideas, and now we get, and sorry, I will give you some data, so if you don't like data, I apologize, but it's lots of graphics, so I start with the longevity revolution. Number one revolution, just to remember, if you think that the past were golden years, here is a quote from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, and he was describing the past, or you could say the state of nature. It's a continual fear, danger of violent death, and the life of man was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So when people tell you, oh, you remember how the past were golden years, go back to Thomas Hobbes and this quote. Of course, demographers have, and here I have a very macro perspective, increasing life expectancy at the global level. Of course, these are estimates. You can get better data at the national level, like I know better data at the Italian level or Sweden. But you could say in 120 years, there's been a 40-year increase in life expectancy. My director of the Max Planck Institute, Jim Vopel, used to say, okay, think about this as gaining 8 hours per day. 8 hours per day come for free, and you come here, you listen to this lecture, you go out, you have good drinks, maybe you have a cotoletta alla milanese or Wiener Schnitzel. We will solve that issue one day. And for 8 hours, you don't basically pay for these 8 hours because life expectancy is increasing in the moment. Of course, demographers will say it's not exactly like that, but this is the long-term change in demography. Longevity revolution. Okay, you also see that sometimes there are situations in which it goes down, and COVID is the most recent one. So with longer lives, of course it makes sense to invest in the future. And that's why this revolution is a precondition to all the rest. So in the past, in the state of nature, you didn't have to think about the future. The future was something that was not planned. So, but if you have longer lives, then you can think about education. So here we are in an Academy of Science. You can think more about science, about entrepreneurship, creating a business that will last more than our lives. You can think about savings and investment. You can think, and this is a kind of a mechanism called usually demographic transition, that if children do not die very frequently during their first year, maybe you can invest more in what is called the quality of children, or let's say, which is connected again to education. And at the societal level, then it makes sense to think about the long term, and then the birth of the educational system is there. And I will go back to the next revolution to talk about that. But I would like also to point the diversity implication of longer lives, which is generational diversity. This is the population pyramid, the age pyramid, as it is called, of the world in 1960, estimates of the United Nations. And okay, it's not a pyramid like in Giza or whatever you can think about. But it's a pyramid in a sense that the biggest share is the newborns. So this has been the history of humanity, a history in which the children were the biggest group. There were a little bit of a few adults and not many old people. So old people were people like me, 55, it was pretty oldish, okay? This is 1960. This is 2025. Okay, I have, so let me go back. So this is generational diversity. For the first time in human history, we have several generations living together at the same time, first thing. The second bit is that this is no longer a perfect pyramid, because if you go at the bottom of this, it will be hard to climb the pyramid. Actually, in many European countries, this is resembling a container ship seen from behind. And why? Because basically the peak number of births in humanity has possibly been reached, and it's 2012. So if you have children at 2012, it's the peak birth year. But this means that we have people of different ages, and we were not used to that. We have many rules in which kind of this generational diversity is becoming a potential challenge. If you want to see some other estimates, I use UN data. If you want to see the word, just look at the blue line. And this is a measure of concentration of age, very simple. It's a Gini, like when you do concentration of income. So high concentration means lower generational diversity, and generational diversity had possibly at the global level its peak after the big baby boom of the 60s and 70s, and then it's going down. Of course, some of that is estimates for the future, and maybe it can come back again if we don't have many kids. But that's so basically we are living in the most diverse period in terms of generation of humanity. Is that good or bad? I think we need more research to establish the strength of generational diversity. Here I took an Harvard Business Review case, so paper, where they are describing one innovation, given that we are in science. Let's say I'm taking a advanced technology example, and here the idea is that to develop a new product that takes programming, experience, and other skills, you need to exploit the role of different generations. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but if you think about a team work, in many innovations you need experience from people of different generations. And again, the word was not used to that. The word is used more to a linear model in which older people are wiser. But we know that technological change is making, yes, you need wise people, but you also need quick people who are maybe, in our case, digitally native. So in this case, we don't know much. There are a couple of papers showing that age diversity is an advantage, but it's still an infant field, I believe, by definition, because it's the first time in history that we really observe age diversity. And here I'm saying age and generational. Of course, again, the demographers will distinguish that, but let's say from a cross-sectional perspective, this is the same issue. Because we live longer, we could have the education revolution. And here we are in the city where demography has married human capital, and I like to tribute Wolfgang Lutz for this fantastic idea. And I'm also quoting Claudia Golding, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and she is defining the 20th century as the human capital century, and she's describing the success story of America in the 20th century. I'm not speaking of 21st, I'm gonna move to the 21st, as human capital century, centrality of education in the development of a country. Okay, and this is an educational revolution. If you want to see the global perspective, I'm using a lot Max Roser's work on awarding data. If you want to see the global perspective, for instance, look at literacy versus illiteracy. We started the 20th century with a majority, actually the vast majority of the world still being illiterate. Maybe talking to an Academy of Sciences, you don't figure that out, but the world was quite illiterate at the beginning of the 20th century. At the end of the 20th century, okay, there are still some, but the fight against illiteracy has been won. Okay? End of the 20th century. This was a revolution. Thank you, Wittgenstein Center. I hope I use the latest version. Thank you, Anne. Merci. This is a graphic explorer. This is the pyramid of 1950. So 75 years ago, by education. And again, it was a pyramid. And the educational level, let's say, just focus on two colors. Red is no education, blue is university, okay, as a contrast. Actually, it's post-secondary, let me be precise, I hope. So the world was very much red in 1950. And the world managed to go through the educational revolution with demographic expansion. So more people and school. Actually, if you think about that, it has also an economic sense. It's, I mean, if you get to scale of building schools and so on, it's better to have more people than fewer people. We are seeing that as a challenge in the depopulating areas of Europe, in which it's no longer viable to have schools for many places because there are not many pupils. So this is to the right, you see the world in 2025 with blue coming to the forefront and university education or post-secondary education becoming particularly significant. So at the global level, almost a quarter of the young people get a post-secondary degree. It's also thanks to the success stories of China, but also to a push by India. Of course, these countries count a lot. But it's a big story. Actually, I'm using also the predictions 75 years ahead. It's, of course, this is a scenario. You have to take this as a scenario. This is the medium scenario. You see how much blue is there. So the medium scenario, the central scenario of the Wittgenstein Center shows that if we follow the path we are currently on, the majority of young people in the world will have a tertiary degree by the end of this century. So this is why I call the 21st century the university century. So if the 20th century was the human capital century, the 21st is the university century. Good news for those of us who are in academia. And of course, this depends a lot on many countries with many people expanding the university system, which is different from old Europe with fewer people trying to push for the university system. So the 20th was the human capital century. Educational revolution was in literacy. Then the education revolution is continuing with the university century. So what is the kind of diversity that the educational revolution is bringing? Again, it has already been mentioned. It brings diversity by social origin. And then I could say the word before was a closed society word, to use Popper's word. It was a word in which, of course, there were universities and academies, but it was very unlikely to move up the social ladder. And that's contrary to much discussion that social mobility was higher in the past. Here are some very easy graphs, and they basically say, if you take tertiary educated, this is US, UK, and Germany at a given point in time, and basically you take the same figure and for some comparable definition of coming from working class. Of course, there is no real convergence at the moment. There are still differentials, but we have never had as many university graduates from working class families as today. So diversity by social origin in terms of university level degree is at the highest point in time. Of course, there are some blips every now and then, but this is something that we should consider seriously. There's been work by demographers. This is a fantastic paper. One of them was a Bocconi graduate, Martina Beretta, and she's working at Nuffield College, so I like that combination. And basically, they are looking at a broad set of countries and showing that with educational expansion, the correlation between parents and children, educational level, is decreasing. So this is, I mean, you can have a look at the paper if you are interested. Educational expansion is directly linked to more social mobility. And I like to repeat that because in many occasions there is an attack on the expansion of education saying that this is against social mobility. There is zero empirical evidence for that. Actually, this is I think a great paper, and all the empirical evidence is on the other side, but it's a bit logic. You don't need big rocket science to do that. If you have more people accessing education, this means more opportunities for social mobility. So there is diversity by social origin. There can be diversity by social origin, more diversity now in the Austrian Academy and all Academy of Sciences because of this change. Okay, third revolution, the gender revolution. And again, in many situations, we tend to see the glass half empty and say, okay, there's many years to get to gender parity. I mean, as you understand, this is a half-full glass type of argument I'm bringing, and at the end, that's very Popperian, trying to think about how can we think about the future. This is, for instance, if we look at the 20th century, when we started the 20th century, basically very few countries had the universal right to vote for women and men. So this was the 20th century at the beginning. At the end of the 20th century, at least in the vast majority of the world, there is equal treatment from a gender perspective. And you can also, you will not realize, this is statistics on the number of countries. For instance, domestic violence was not sanctioned in the majority of the world countries until very recently ago. The employment discrimination was not prohibited, and there's a number of other data you can see. So the argument is that the gender revolution is there, has been there for a while. Of course, there is more to be done, but this is, like in the previous situation, this is the best moment in human history if we take a global perspective. And then there is a bit of demography, and this has been studied not only by demographers, but again by Claudia Goldin. Of course, modern contraceptives allowed this gender revolution to flourish by separating the career decisions and the decision to have children. Actually, in a sense, we have, again, to adapt to this situation by understanding that we need to develop societal and policy responses to this challenge. The fact that you have contraception by default rather than the lack of contraception by default. And so this is, again, Goldin's work. There has been a convergence in labor force participation at all women, while in the past, and this is US data, in the past women tended to be participating only when they were single and never married. And now there is a convergence. And these are all data. If you want to see a bit of younger data, share of women in the workforce. Okay, so this is the gender revolution. It's incomplete, but the position of women at a global level in the economy, in politics, in society has never been as central as today. And I'm happy to interact on this. Of course, again, also this revolution is directly linked, but this is obvious, to gender diversity. I can point various ways through which you can see gender diversity. For instance, now, basically the gap in tertiary education, these again are global data, has been reversed. Women with more degrees than men. This is not the case if we take STEM degrees, but there are some countries yet that discriminate between boys and girls, especially in primary and secondary education. But if you think about the sequence, longevity brought education. Education is central to the gender revolution, because in the absolute majority of countries, educational systems were not discriminating at the bottom. They tended to discriminate when going up the ladder, and things are improving yet. So again, gender diversity is one of the consequences for our societies of this long-term change that has been accelerated by technologies around contraception recently. Is this good or bad? There are many ways, there are many papers on gender diversity. I like to mention this macro paper on gender diversity and economic growth, and the argument of Jonathan Ostry from Bruegel in Brussels is that there are some complementarities between men and women, and these complementarities are basically helpful in accounting for some diversity effects that you would not see if there was a complete segregation. So also this diversity is good for humanity. So generational diversity, hopefully it's good. Maybe we should get more data. Educational diversity, diversity by social origin and broadening the pool of education, broadening the pool of talent is good for humanity by all kinds of research, and also gender diversity here. This is maybe the most politically debated type of revolution. I always start from the very long run, and here I like to tribute Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza with Feldman in particular. They contributed a lot on the history of humanity by tracing genes, and this is always to remember the diversity of humans coming from the Horn of Africa. Ideally, Europe was populated with black people with blue eyes, and then us with dark eyes took over the majority of the world, and so on. And so this is kind of the history of genes. It's very interesting, but just to remember that, of course, it's very easy to say that migration has always been there, otherwise it will not exist. If I go to the more recent data, it's very hard to say what is really revolutionary. I have to say the size of migration, the size of movement is revolutionary in terms of mere size. Some colleagues will say, we don't know if we live in the peak migration era. Also, we don't have data. And again, humanity has always been moving. The borders are possibly 17th, 18th century creation. So if we look at the number of people who live outside the country of birth, 300 million, it has never been as high as it is today. And estimates on internal migration, and I'll go back to internal migrations, are more or less 4 to 5 times this number. So migration revolution means that many people are moving. These are data from, again, the UN. I pointed to the United Arab Emirates, 88% of the population classifies as migrants. Of course, maybe two types, so the kind of the expats that will come from this audience and the workers coming from poorer countries, but that's, again, a different story. For the demographers here, how important is migration on demographic change? Here I'm using very long-term the data from Sweden. One measure to grasp the speed of population change is the population turnover rate, basically looking at the speed of change through how many people enter, how many people leave a population divided by the number of people. Basically, turnover was very high before the demographic transition when mortality was high and fertility was high. It declines during the demographic transition because both mortality and fertility are high. And at some point it started, and this is Sweden, sort of becoming a bit more stable and maybe slightly trending upwards. But what is interesting is the dashed line below. What is the share of turnover due to migration? Because believe me or not, there are two ways to enter a population and two ways to exit a population. Two ways to enter a population are by birth and by immigration. Birth happens always at age 0, by the way. And then there are two ways to leave a population. One is emigration, and the other one is death. And of course, sooner or later it will come, better late than sooner. But what is interesting here is that the share of turnover due to migration, and this is international migration, has been increasing over time since at least the 1950s in Sweden. And this is basically all over the world. And the more fine-grained you go, the more migration is important to explain population change. And this is why we could see this as a migration revolution. If you want to see another way, is cities versus other areas. These are recent data from World Urbanization Prospects. We are also living in a most urban era of human history, meaning that maybe that's not easy to see that always from a local perspective, but from a global perspective, cities have been home to more humans now than ever. And these are some data with projections, population living in cities, in towns, which is basically 50K or around, and rural areas. Rural areas is pretty flat. We have now 33 megacities of 10 plus million. Only one of them is in the European Union, and it's Paris, because London is no longer in the EU. Maybe they come back, then we have 2 megacities. If we look at the megacities, in 75 there were only 8 megacities, then in 2020 megacities, and now 33 megacities, and so on. So globally, the migration revolution is not only international migration, it's also urbanization. It's the movement to cities, okay? Very important to understand that. What does this bring in terms of diversity? I mean, you've already, I hope, understood where I'm going. The migration revolution is directly linked, by the way, to the emergence of the so-called global cities idea, and we live in one of them, so I'm going to show that to you. The migration revolution is directly linked to diversity by place of origin. This was, in particular, described in the idea of superdiversity, which is based, in particular, starting from the city of London, and this is one of the various streets in which you can walk and you find restaurants from all over the world. The anthropologist Steven Vertovec is behind this idea of looking at superdiversity, which is very much tied to the idea of going beyond a dichotomy of natives versus immigrants or majority and minority, but thinking about the whole diversity and the intersecting part of diversity. So imagine an Italian and a German living in Vienna. I mean, what is that majority, minority? And thank you, Herr Director. So what is the super diverse city? It's mostly global cities. And if you don't think about international migration, think about internal migrations. If you take cities, and this is again the majority of the world population, these cities have people coming from all over the place. Again, thanks Anne, and this is the WIREL project. This is Vienna. I only took, this is Vienna in 71, more or less, when I was born. 96% of the population Austrian. Maybe some of you will say, oh, it was fantastic then. Okay, and I'm not going to argue this. I'm just describing the change. This is the last one I could find, 2011. Of course, Austrian citizenship moved to 78%, and then you saw the diversity of the origins of people living in Vienna. And I looked also at this. This is the title of the city of Vienna, so I'm not. So the city of Vienna is claiming, I think, when I read the document, with some pride of being a global city. And here is the title, is basically more or less half of the population is of foreign origin. Of course, foreign origin, I think, will include some folks who are technically Austrian citizens. And this is the recent data from 2025. So this means that basically in many places in the world, you have folks coming from different countries, certainly from outside the city they live in. And cities have become increasingly more central. Okay? I hope I convinced you about these 4 revolutions and the 4 diversities that come with it. By the way, is that good or bad for the economy? There's tons of papers. Broadly speaking, the most recent evidence, the paper was called Revisiting the Evidence, is fairly positive. These are data in Africa, but I will not mention that. Basically, all the kind of empirical work, with some exception, is showing that if you go to a fine-grained situation, having diversity in a team is usually bringing innovation. But we can go back to this on the discussion side. Okay, so far I've used the 4 revolutions. I've used 4 revolutions, and I have to say I used 4 dimensions that demographers can say they are fixed relatively early, not necessarily at birth, and they are used also for the magic multi-state forecasts and scenarios that were developed mostly around here. So the year of birth you cannot change forever. It's attached to your ID. Okay. Then there is education. Of course, you can change. Normally, kind of traditional education is fixed at a recently kind of low age. Gender, of course, you can change, but the vast majority doesn't. Place of origin, if you take the place of birth, I'm afraid you cannot escape that. It's written forever again in your ID. Okay, start to combine these dimensions, and here I'm using UK census data, just to simplify that. There are 19 ethnic groups, 6 social classes because of diversity by social origin. Even if you use a very marketing-based definition of generation, which is 5, it's very American, but it's fine, and only 2 genders, you have 140 categories. Each of you is one of 140 categories. If we add 8 gender categories or the whole 101 age categories, we get to, and this is a combinatorics, we get to 100,000 and so. So there are many cells. We don't like to be in cells normally. I know maybe some monks and nuns do that, and Mark is studying them. So basically, this means that we are already super diverse at the origin. It's very hard to dichotomize who we are. We belong to several categories simultaneously. Then there are even more categories. If you want, we can add religion. And again, Weir and other projects were also doing that. Maybe something that comes from your family, but you can also change. It's not directly linked to the place of origin, and so on. And we can add many of these dimensions, and so we are even more super diverse. Where we need to move even further is to understand that, okay, especially because life is long, we are not only differing by our origin situation, but we are different by our life course situation, life course status. And because life course is long, this becomes increasingly more important. So the difference between people are important, but there are also important differences within people. Occupation, otherwise we wouldn't fight for a career. Income, wealth, they all change. There is a National Transfer Account project where Alexia and others have contributed significantly, basically based on life cycle ideas. Clearly, during our life, we differ by income consumption. We differ by place of residence, place of work, family status, educational subject, lifestyle, ability and disability. So, okay, some people are born with genetic disability, but if you look at computations or estimates of developing disability during life, the US Actuary Service says that if you start at age 18, you have a 25% chance of developing disability during your work life. And so this is something that may change over the course of our life. While we have all these dimensions, we could say now we have perfect data, and Matt Salganik and others at Princeton are trying to say, okay, since we have all this data, can we predict the future of our lives? And luckily, or maybe just empirically, basically, the answer is no. Even if we have all this diversity and we have fantastic data, combining this data is not particularly good at predicting the next move in individual lives. That's why we need to think about hyperdiversity as a guiding line. Let's say we start super diverse, we become hyperdiverse. This is the main outcome triggered by the mother of all changes, which is demography. I have to say that the notion of hyperdiversity has already been used in the literature, and it's been used to describe cities, and the critique of Van Kempen and others was to the superdiversity. Superdiversity was not enough to describe global cities. I think that discussion on cities is lacking a little bit the life course approach of changes within life. But let's say, I'm happy to say that I'm borrowing this concept. And again, we are diversely different. So, and here you see again the quote, if I've seen further, it's by standing on the shoulder of giants. Of course, in the past, there's been situations in which we arrived here through the contribution of many folks. Some of them were coming from lower social backgrounds. We had women contributing. We certainly had people moving from all over the world. We had people of different generations. But if we look forward, we have to think about how to first realize that we live in a hyper-diverse world, and there is no simplification that will bring us back that is justified. So diversity brought us where we are today. We have never lived in a world as diverse and as with a high level of well-being as today. Hyperdiversity is also allowing more talents to flourish. If we assume, and there is all scientific evidence for that, that talent is evenly distributed, opportunity is not, then of course, making talents flourish is good for humanity. Imagine the type of scientific advances we can use, the technological innovations, the kind of progress for humanity that we can flourish. This is, I believe, exactly in line with the open society idea of Popper. So, is this all flowers? Can we go and get our aperitivo soon? Of course we should. But again, no revolution is a gala dinner. We need some innovation. First of all, if I convinced you, we need to think about this idea in our research and what are the implications of that. What are the implications for policies? The implications for policies normally tend to be simplifying. Okay, to whom should I give this policy? Give me a simple rule. Below that threshold, you get the policy. Above that threshold, you don't get the policy. Okay, this is the simplification that may work, but in general, reality is much more complex. Of course, some companies are doing that. If you ask for a mortgage, a bank is running a credit scoring or some kind of algorithm based on the best data they could collect, and they will say yes or no to your mortgage. But in terms of policy, business, science responses, we need to be innovative and to adapt to the hyper-diverse world. We also need to think about the inequality consequences. So some hyperdiversity comes with costs to what maybe term the losers. We need to think about this force. So I think it's a fantastic time for social sciences. We also need to prevent scapegoating. So diverse people are not to be blamed for all our problems because we are all diverse, but in particular, again, many of the innovations come from this diversity. And populism always tends to be dichotomizing reality, and that's something I credit a lot to Amartya Sen. Dichotomizing reality is one of the big mistakes we can do if reality is so complex. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for this great presentation. I think that my suspect that we might witness the introduction of a new term and concept in demographic thinking was true. And thank you also very much for this attempt to bring so many different concepts and different approaches together. So I think it's really wonderful how you combine existing knowledge and observation and to bring our understanding to a higher level. That's really great, and I appreciate very, very, very much. Okay, so there were so many aspects and different ideas and thoughts. So the floor is open for questions and comments, and I see already the first sign here, Gustav Feichtinger. Just a moment, here's the microphone. No, the microphone, please.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for this brilliant talk. My question is, in which direction is hyperdiversity going in the long run? So as you said, in the past, it was less diverse than it's now. But I think I understand the gender diversity and migration diversity, but there seems to be examples, you gave one, and I know at least two, and let me mention just one, where there is a convergence from non-diverse to also non-diverse polarization. This example on the literacy and the illiteracy. In the long run, there's no diversity. Everybody will be literate.
Thank you. No, thanks a lot. Of course, in a sense, literacy is one example in which we will want not to have diversity. the diversity in the educational revolution is the diversity by social origin. So the idea that to get to the highest levels of education, you have a heterogeneous pool of talents that will develop their talents to the biggest extent. So I still believe that the direction for 1 century, so I'm not willing, and actually to learn from Popper, I should not make any forecast. That's historicism, it should be forbidden. But let's say the direction is to more diversity, and the diversity there is by social origin in terms of educational levels and achievement. But of course, this is, I will say, it's an empirical question. I think one way to see that is that we are seeing more kind of a move towards, you can call it methodological individualism, also again to mention a Viennese idea, and say we are seeing a convergence to a more individualized perspective on being diversity different. But yes, more diversity.
Thank you. We had a question here from my colleague Jalal Abbasi Shawatzi.
Thank you, Francesco. We enjoyed your talk. My question also follows what Gustav suggested. We are living in a globalized world. With the new technology, ideas have become more similar. As you said, the societies are more literate, or university, what they call it, level education, that brings behavioral change. They are living in cities, there are more similar lifestyles, and et cetera, et cetera. So how do you see this in the context that you are analyzing?
Thank you. This is a fundamental question. It's been discussed a little bit in, let's say, the politics literature, and I can mention the distinction between the somewheres and the anywheres. So basically, in global city, people will feel welcome whether they are in Vienna, Milan, or New York, or Vancouver, rather than being in the countryside in each of these countries. And this will be the people feeling themselves at ease in global cities are the somewhere. They can, sorry, the anywhere. They can live basically anywhere. And then there are the people who feel very much attached to a specific place. These are the somewhere. And the idea could be that with globalization, the risk is to being derooted and being somewhere, and people can become more similar when independently of where they live. Again, I think this is an empirical question. There are some evidence of convergence between young people in different societies. This may move to less difference in lifestyle. I think still longer life and differentiation over time may play a role. But I'm not too sure about how to answer your question at the moment. Sorry, no certainty.
It's very open. We had a question here, Gerda.
Okay, Francesco, many thanks, very inspiring. 2 things. The first one, I thought quite a few of the things that you mentioned are convergence, not diversity or not revolutions. And then I was wondering about one revolution that is going on now, and that is the fertility revolution. We actually have in a lot of societies moving towards a child-free society. So how do you see you have the longevity revolution in there, but not the fertility revolution that is just starting in the 21st century. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Gerda. So to escape the question, I will say I've already studied fertility. No, just... okay, no, the convergence point is important, and I'm going to talk specifically of gender, where there is only... I think for the other revolutions, it's a little bit less, although you could argue that convergence between social groups in education. I think convergence is part of the process, but the diversity at the destination is where I'm aiming. And say, take the Academy of Sciences. how diverse is the composition of the academy. Of course, this means that in order to get there, you have to have a convergence in the process of education and scientific career. And so, in a sense, convergence and diversity are not necessarily one against each other in a dynamic sense. Where is fertility here? It's basically in many situations. Fertility is one of the situations in which maybe generational diversity is at risk. So to go back to Gustav and Jalal's point, is this reversible? I will say, of course, if we stop having children, suddenly generational diversity will go back to the past. And this is in particular the situation of extremely low fertility places like Italy, where you have generations that are 3 times bigger than the number of births we have now. So in a sense, fertility may be a threat to more generational diversity. Fertility change is part of the investment in human capital. But again, this is a situation in which societies have to adopt. And when I think about, adapt, not adopt. Talking of fertility, of course, adoption is adoption. Basically, being adaptive means you have lower fertility, you take advantage to increase the educational level. And usually the example is Korea. Or Japan, with high investments in few kids. The counterexample of not adopting the right measures or adapting to the change is Italy, where we combine low fertility with low levels of education. So that's kind of another way in which fertility enters. And of course, in the gender revolution, fertility enters in a and you worked on that in how societies adapt to a kind of more equal roles or more diversity in work context, more gender diversities. If societies don't adapt, there is no way we are gonna keep some fertility levels. And of course, big reversals of fertility, that's a different story. But I mean, you know the literature on this.
So we had here one question, and then we go back on the left side.
Thank you very much for all you told us about hyperdiversity, which I agree very much. But I think there's one question that we have to agree soon, and that is to be more in touch with biosphere, with the other non-human creatures, and what the whole problematic sphere. What do you say about that in respect with not the same time with hyperdiversity? We have to preserve our not only resources, which, yeah.
Thank you. Let's say I have to acknowledge that here I'm on my weak side. Of course, if we are talking of biodiversity, broadly speaking, we need to include also non-humans, and that's where we probably are. I mean, by all accounts, scientific accounts, there is a declining diversities. Let's say the escape answer will be I'm not equipped to work with that, but I think it's an interesting story in terms of, okay, how do we have to preserve diversity? It's also showing the kind of non-human world. It's a case in which it's usually easy to show that diversity is good, broadly speaking. And so it's another example where we can see the fruits of diversity. I use always the idea of grapes. Sorry, I'm also a sommelier for the friends who know that. So the grapes, the most diverse grape types are in a country called Italy, where we have the highest diversity of native grapes. Preserving native grapes, we know, is good for our happiness and well-being. but it's not a gala dinner. So again, we need to think about that. But I sort of had to escape your question because I'm not really expert.
So, would have here.
Thank you very much for your talk. And when you look at the data and the story that this data is telling, it almost seems, or if you don't think about it too much, it almost seems like a natural phenomenon that diversity is increasing. But of course, a lot of it, or most of it, is because of human decisions, because people wanted diversity to happen, they wanted everybody to vote, etc. And now we live in a time where there's many, especially political actors, who think that diversity is not a good thing, who want to less political diversity, not everybody the right to vote, etc. And my question to you is, how do you think about that phenomenon? Does that even play a role, or do you think that diversity will be even bigger no matter what?
Thank you. I think your point is fundamental. Diversity was created by individual decisions, in some sense, rational decisions, in some cases. In other cases, it was by design. For instance, the educational revolution was consistent from a rational perspective from individuals investing in the future, but also some countries decided to launch broad educational systems. So Russia and later the United States or Sweden and so on. And this has expanded. So there were decisions both at the micro level that are consistent and at the, let's say, at the government level. In migration, for instance, for a long time, especially what we call now new world countries, of course, it's a simple, they were attractive. And if you look at the citizenship laws in America, for instance, in the Americas, they are all citizenship by birth. And of course, attracting migrant was part of the game until at least the beginning of the 20th century for all these countries. And still, the citizenship regulation remained, despite some attempts, for instance, that President Trump is doing, they still remain strongly on hold. And so, in a sense, yes, all of this is not a natural phenomenon. I have to say that some of the innovations that brought the longevity revolution are, however, fundamental for all other diversities. Without longer lives, and again, long life is not natural, you're right. In a state of nature, you remember Hobbes, we will not live longer. And then we had a number of people who found innovations. So I always tribute Ignaz Semmelweis, also from Vienna, for innovations on delivery and so on. Because of these kind of individuals and other systems of public health, we live longer. And once you develop the longevity revolution, of course, as a byproduct, you have generational diversity, but you also have a rationale for all the other revolutions. And once you develop education, then you have a rationale for having men and women studying alike. And if you have a long life, it makes sense to move country because it pays over a longer period. Yeah, again, this is not taken for granted. We may go back, and going back may be a political decision, as you said. We may decide to close borders. We may decide to send back to women to the cooking room. We may decide to have barriers by generations. We may decide to have to kind of go back. What I like to basically to argue here is, first of all, each of these pieces is combined or intersected, to use a word that has been used in the literature on intersectionality. But it's kind of intersecting in a way that makes it more complex. The choices to make this binary are normally choices that are political and normally choices that tend to favor polarization. And again, I tribute Amartya Sen for that. It is possible that we go back to that. Yes, it's possible. I think what is important is that we recognize where this path has brought us. We can always say, and again, we are currently in a super diverse city, in a city where people come from all over the world. Is that good or bad for Vienna and for Austria? I leave that for you to decide. I think we have enough data to give the answer. It's important that scientists, social scientists in particular, are firm on the data. And then, of course, politicians will use the idea. They may even speak against this. It's fine. I think this is politics. And I try to be a social scientist here. And I try to convince you as a scientist, independently of your discipline, that this line of reasoning makes sense. And maybe you will falsify that. And again, we are in the Popper lecture. It's perfectly fine.
We had here a question, the second row, the lady.
Well, my questions have been already led into by previous two questions. First, the diversity and inclusion studies in the US are being defunded. So that's what you're summarizing under reactions to, as populism. And also, the world's population right now is consuming 1.7 worlds every year, according to one statistics. So we are overpopulated. Do you have some comments on that?
Thank you. On the first point, yes, of course, scapegoating diversity is a favored approach by many. You remember when there was a crash between a plane and a helicopter on the Potomac River, and this is where basically President Trump and even Vice President J.D. Vance said, oh, it's because of diversity that this crash happened. Actually, all investigations so far have ruled out that the diversity and inclusion policies have anything to do with that. But of course, this stays in the discussion, and this is helping to defund research. So I'm probably not going to be funded from this kind of sources, but it's fine. I mean, this is part of kind of, I think, scientific choices. But I know that this is a challenge. Again, if we want an open society, we have to live up with these challenges. The other point on overpopulation, yeah, I'm not arguing that the world should grow, that we should have many kids. I think, and here there is also, and again, the group in Vienna has worked a lot on adaptation to climate change and so on. Normally, the argument I'm going to bring is that fertility is already almost at an equilibrium level at the global level. So estimates of the number of children are 2.2 average. So it's true that the world population will keep growing, but at some point it will decrease. One of the challenges is the diversity of rates of change. So lots of births in Africa, few births in Europe, and I think that's the most challenging part of that. The world population is not going to explode in the future. We have to develop certainly adaptation and mitigation to climate change, and that's part of, again, exploiting the talents. Superdiversity and hyperdiversity even more are bringing more opportunities to develop the innovations that are useful in making sure we preserve our planet and maybe even biodiversity. I will argue that, but it's more an argument than a kind of statement which has a strong scientific backing.
So here on the right was one more question.
Thank you. So I think on the 11th of February, it was the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. But I think what many of us are observing is that there is a bottleneck in academia. There is a bottleneck also when it comes to the economic system, where you don't have many women and, as board members. And it's not only restricted to gender, but also to migration background, and then also politics. And so my question now is, how important do you think is representation in all of this, let's call them leading positions, especially for societal stability or also democracy?
So let's say I answer very immediately to your last question. How important? Yes. Let's say if we assume that diversity is bringing innovation and is allowing all talents to flourish, then we should have all this diversity at all levels. So it is important, and it's not only me. It's basically all the research on the impact of diversity. One of the challenges, however, if I have to say, kind of develop a critical way, is to say only take one of these dimensions as the focus one. So it's important to have a Women in Science Day, but if we have to say only women versus men, and then you mention, okay, the place of origin, I have to argue generational, because sometimes you saw the data, women are more educated than men, especially in richer societies. So if you don't consider generational diversity, you are blocking also many women. So the intersection of all of these is important. Focusing on one dimension may be to the detriment of the general diversity policies that we want to achieve. But of course, and again, it's important to see the glass half empty, because many of the measures that have been taken have improved the situation. It's not necessarily where we would want to be. It's the same in terms of diversity by social origin, but it's still the right direction. But I think the multidimensionality is the important bit I'd like to emphasize here.
Okay, here, Michael.
Yeah, thank you for both the talk and the really inspiring discussion. I think I still grapple with some of the fundamentals, and forgive me for asking this very late. So I keep wondering, diversity in regard to what, and sort of on the basis of what? So let me just try to subsume, and maybe I can elicit some comments on your part on where I should read this up, because I think we can't discuss it today. So you started, I think in your presentation, you started to kind of speak about diversity at the basis, so to speak. So if we assume a population that is composed of certain groups by gender, by ethnic background, full stop, and say you have fixed your diversity at the basis, then I suppose the question of diversity may, for instance, come up again with economic development. So suddenly you have scope for education. So you're creating sort of diversity in terms of functions, the educated and the non-educated. And then, and you mentioned all of this, you mentioned mobility. So then you have mobility or selection of kind of people who are diverse at the origin, so to speak, into these functionalities. And this is, what I'm grappling is, where do I start to measure things, to understand this? Because in principle, you could have like a population which doesn't change at all its diversity at the background, but it keeps changing functional diversity. And then, of course, it gets even more complicated if people, in fact, change themselves over their life course. And that's where I get lost. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's say, so what you're describing is a sort of the move to hyperdiversity. Of course, life course, especially longer life course, and life course are longer at the global level. That's important, are bringing exactly these changes. My argument is that even if we stopped at the very beginning, because of changes, not it was not always like that. In a closed society, you were assigned your role at birth, and you were not going to change that. And this is, again, the definition of closed society by Popper. Once you change with longevity, this triggers this number of revolution, which is changing at least diversity at the beginning. But of course, you may argue, maybe your argument is that this diversity as a beginning in terms of explaining where we are at a specific moment is only a small subject. And I agree with that, but remember that humanity started with ascription, with the idea that at the beginning of your life, your destiny should have been written. And now we are moving to a situation in which ascription is not really there, but in addition to that, there is a lot of variance, let me call it like that, over life. And that's part of the situation in which we are now if we measure a cross-sectional glimpse of lives. And that's kind of why we are diversely different. I'm going to send you, once I written this decently, but of course there is some part of the literature that is dealing with that ideas, mostly on the predictability of life courses, where maybe if I can argue, there's been a mass collaboration attempt using what in the US is called the fragile families study, where many scholars from different disciplines were challenged to say, can you predict someone during childhood, given all the background information and all the trajectory until, I think, age 6, can you predict where these folks will be at age 11? And all the fantastic algorithms and perfect data did not make a prediction that was really better than a kind of random algorithm. And so that's kind of part of the challenge we are having. Of course, once you take averages, you could say, okay, you saw that. If you come from a social background that is working class, you have a lower chance of getting a university education. But of course, you cannot predict whether a single child having kind of a working class background will graduate or not.
Okay, so I have two more questions. I would ask both of these questioners then to be short, because I know that Francesco has another appointment tonight and the wine was already announced, so we want to enjoy also this. So
sorry,
here one question.
I spoiled the...
No, it was nothing to excuse. It's a very complicated, complex approach, and it's of course very difficult to answer short. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for this interesting talk. If I want to keep my question brief, I want to know, what does this approach or idea of hyperdiversity mean for me as a researcher? How can I implement this huge idea in my quantitative work?
Okay, let's say the simple answer will be that you need to take all these dimensions into account in everything you do. It means that you have to use methods that allow for this complexity to really be taken into account, and to understand what are the costs of simplification. Of course, as a scientist, you need to simplify. You need to have a model, you need to have targets. But the important part is the cost of simplification. Let me give another comparison with medical disciplines. There are medics, yes, I know there is at least one doctor, a medical doctor in the room. So this is a bit the difference between individualized medicines or the touch of a specific clinician against acting per simple categories. At some point, you may need to act using simple categories. My understanding of where medical science is going is adapting increasingly more to human differences, or I will say hyperdiversity. So I think that's the direction. It has challenges. Maybe I don't grasp all the challenges. I hope we need younger generations researchers to grasp all the challenges, or maybe this is just a wrong idea and someone will show that.
I was thinking of the same question because I see many students of our global demography master program here. And but maybe another revolution is helping, the AI revolution that might help to somehow do this quantitatively. Okay, so one final question.
So, Francesco, thanks a lot. There is a word that demographers love, and this is transition. And you never mentioned this. You spoke about hyperdiversity revolution, which is easier, I think. Was it done on purpose?
No, okay. In my written version, I use the word transition as well, but I think, first of all, this is really a kind of demographic jargon that is melting together changes that have to do with kind of mortality and fertility that we are now seeing that are not mechanically linked. So the idea of demographic transition is the idea that once mortality goes down, which I sort of mentioned, then people have fewer kids. But of course, there is nothing about the end of this transition, in particular on fertility. So this is why I didn't use the word transition in the presentation. But I think what I try, maybe it's a narrative trick, I try to argue that there are several revolutions that should be kind of seen together, all linked with specific dimensions of diversity. And the real mother of this revolution is, you could say, the epidemiological transition. I like more longevity revolution. Let me give this as my taste choice. Yep. Also, I'm not only writing for demographers. This is kind of ambitious and say, maybe I told to everyone.
Thank you very much. Many new ideas. Any questions? Very inspiring. Thank you very much. I have now the pleasure to invite you all to a reception downstairs on behalf of Class President Wendehorst and the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Nice opportunity also to get in touch again with our speaker Francesco. I thank you all very much for coming, for this interesting discussion, for the questions, and of course in particular to our speaker Francesco Billari for this very inspiring presentation. Thank you very much for being here. It's really an honor, and see you down.